Hello, my name is Russell Woody. I'm an artist and a technical consultant to the Art Products Division of Binney & Smith, the makers of Liquitex Art Materials. I also lecture at colleges and universities throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. This is a survey of acrylics, all the things that acrylics can do. Now, when most people think of acrylics, they think of a new material. But acrylics are not new. They were invented in the late 1930s, and artists have used them since that time. In fact, the Mexican muralists started to use them in the 30s and early 40s, and then they came into the United States with the advent of abstract expressionism, went on through hard-edge expressionism, and today the uses are for superrealism and for neo-expressionism. They have a long history of what this material can do. I use the acrylics for a very personal reason. I'm allergic to almost everything else there is on the market. Anything that has a solvent connected with it, I cannot use for a long period of time. The acrylics are very simple materials. They clean with water, they mix with water, but they dry waterproof. So they are the ideal material for me for that reason. In fact, there's a label on the back of each tube that says these are non-toxic materials. These materials are tested by the Art and Craft Material Institute, and the standards are set by the Inter-Society Color Council of the American Society of Testing and Materials. They are a material that you can even ingest without harm. That's why I use them. However, most artists use the acrylics because of permanency. They are the most permanent material the artist has to use today. You can do almost anything to the acrylic without having it be damaged. You can fold it in creases if you want to. You can ball it up in knots. If you get mad with it, you can throw it in the floor and stomp on it a while, put it in a washing machine and wash it if you want to, and iron it dry. Now, I don't expect you to do that kind of thing, but it is a material that will last throughout that kind of abuse. In fact, if you did this to oil painting, that would be the end of it right there. The acrylics are inherently flexible materials. They are a material that you can use without deterioration. In fact, you can put 2 inches of paint on a canvas. There are no rules that way. You can throw washes over that, glazes over that, sand and sawdust into the paint. You can do almost anything you want, and it will not deteriorate. Oils, on the other hand, are very complicated materials. They dry not by water evaporation or solvent evaporation, but they dry by oxidation. There's one basic rule that you have to follow in oil painting, among hundreds of others that are listed by Mayer, Dorner, and Gott-Segan on their handbooks on how to paint with oil, and that rule is you paint from lean to fat. Now, lean means there's very little oil in the oil paint. Fat means there's a whole lot of oil in the oil paint. For instance, this is a canvas surface here, and if you put a fatty oil that contains a whole lot of oil, under a lean oil, an oil that has very little oil, the fatty oil continues to dry a long time after this lean oil dries, and it shrinks in the process of drying. And oils take a long time to dry. They take 50 years for the normal oil surface to dry. So you have a built-in time bomb if you paint oil that is fatty under oil that is lean, because this top surface dries first and will crack when the undersurface shrinks that way. There are very few rules to painting with the acrylics. One is, however, to do with surface supports. You do not paint on an oily, greasy, or a hard, shiny surface. Do not paint over oil paints with acrylic. Now, you can paint oils over acrylic. There's some controversy about that, but generally it holds true that oils will stick to acrylics without too much problem. And you do not paint over hard, shiny surfaces such as glass, formica, shiny metals, hardboard, unless you take the shine off the hardboard with a piece of sandpaper. If you do that, the acrylic peels right off the hard, shiny surface. This is what you're painting with, acrylic. This is a pliable, stretchable acrylic. There's very little paint here. There's maybe 50 cents to $1 worth of paint, and then about 5 or 6 coats of what is called gloss, medium, and varnish, just to give it a thickness so you can stretch it. If you put on a couple of coats, it's like a thin polyethylene bag. It will rip easy. If you put on 20 coats, it's like naugahyde. You can then build beanbag chairs out of this. You can make your own plastic sheets. of whatever design you see fit. This can be used for shower curtains, for raincoats, for clothing, anything that you can design with plastic, you can design with the acrylic. Just peel it right off a hard, shiny surface. There is one problem with this, however. In hot, humid weather, this might stick to itself. It is pressure sensitive. To prevent that, before you peel it from a surface, you should apply either a silicone spray or something called Soluvar. A silicone spray you can buy in a hardware store. Soluvar is a resoluble acrylic varnish. You put it over paintings to seal the surface, and you can remove it with mineral spirits. If you're using it for utilitarian purposes, use the silicone. If you're using it for fine arts, use the Soluvar material that way so it will not turn yellow and peel. You can also use the acrylic to take transfers from magazines. This is a page out of an art magazine. It's a little Picasso here that the acrylic gloss medium and varnish has been applied to, and the inks transfer into that surface. Give the reproduction, offset reproduction, about 6 coats of gloss medium. Let each one dry in between. Turn it over on the back where you have not applied the medium. Throw some water or some warm water. In about 5 minutes, the surface becomes translucent, and you can peel the paper from the plastic, but the inks stay in the plastic. At that point, you have a transparent decal of that image that you can stick to any surface or that you can superimpose one over top of the other. You can take images such as this, photographic images as well. You can superimpose those images one over top of the other if you would like that way. You can also use it in a heavier application to show brush strokes. Now, if you take an image such as this and apply it, glue it to canvas, it looks like it's painted on canvas. There's also an unusual process. The acrylics are low-fire ceramic glazes. You can paint the colors on a piece of bisqueware, a piece that's been fired once, and you can fire it at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and it forms a glaze on clay, a utilitarian glaze, not something that should be used for ashtrays or for plates that you cut on. It would scratch. But it's a decorative material that way. This can also be glued to bisqueware and fired at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and this image will form a glaze on the clay. And you should not overfire that. Don't go over 350, because if you do, at 400 to 450 degrees, it will form toxic fumes. So be careful that way. But it is an unusual process of transferring an image into clay work. Now, all of the work that you see here is based on the use of gloss medium and varnish. Now, this is gloss medium and varnish. Your basic medium, you use it to thin your colors with, you use it to give transparency to color, and you use it for glazing techniques, and you can also use it for collage. It is a good glue, among other things. You can throw the medium onto the surface and collage tissue paper, almost any other kind of paper you can think of. Now, this tissue paper is a fugitive material. The acrylic does not make any color permanent that is fugitive, but you can make your own papers that are quite permanent by soaking them in an acrylic solution of color that way. You can use this for graphic design, for commercial work, but I wouldn't suggest it for fine art work unless you make your own papers. You can also use a little bit of color here, and you can rough up the surface a little bit to give it texture, creating very quick designs that way, and you can throw other materials in there. This is a piece of canvas. You can soak that in the medium, and that forms a good bond on the surface. So almost anything you can think of to put into the painting surface can be done with relative permanency of the material. And you can keep working back over until you achieve the image that you would like. The acrylics were first invented as a substitute for oil glaze as well, a glaze that can be applied very quickly and yet be quite permanent. For an oil glaze, you just add a little bit, very little bit, of transparent color, and colors are listed on the container here as transparent, opaque, or translucent, and you use a little bit of color and a whole lot of medium. Every 15 minutes you can throw on another glaze. Now I don't have time to do that, but if you wait the proper time it doesn't pick up. I'll give you an idea of how basically that works. In a day's working time, you can throw 30 or 40 glazes one over top of the other. If you were doing that with oil paint, it would take you, if you waited the proper amount of time between each glaze, it would take you about a year to do the same thing that you can do in one day in using the acrylic. It has depth of color, intensity of color, and a gloss quality that even surpasses that of oil. Now, the reason these mediums, these acrylic mediums, look milky is they are the suspension of acrylic particles in water. Suspension of a material that is not normally miscible in water. In fact, you have thousands of little particles of acrylic floating in water. Now, that's what makes that look milky. That diffuses the light. But when the water evaporates out of there, these particles come together and fuse, forming an acrylic film. And eventually they form a film that marries with every other film underneath. In dealing with acrylics, you're dealing with one solid piece of plastic. However, when this film dries, it also breathes. It's like a membrane that lets in water, and water can seep back into that. Because of that, you need a final removable and sealing type of varnish. That varnish, again, is Soluvar. It comes in a spray, and it comes as well in brushable consistencies, and it comes in gloss and matte that way. After you finish the painting, you should give it a coat of Soluvar, a solution as opposed to an emulsion, and that seals the surface. It protects the surface from moisture. It also protects the surface from dirt and grime and grease and pollution. If this gets dirty, you can take it off, cleaning the painting with mineral spirits, and give it another coat of the Soluvar. There are thicker mediums that you also can use with the acrylic, and the one that gives body to paint and also transparency to paint is called gel medium. Now, gel medium is about the same thing as the gloss medium, only it's twice as thick. It is a good collage material as well. You can stick almost anything in with the gel medium and it stays there. You can put in the bottle tops, you can throw in the painting knives, you can do anything you want. You can put canvas to the ceiling and it won't fall down on you. It's a good, heavy, gluing material. And you can also use this for mixing in any textural material, any aggregate material that you want to add to your painting for texture can be done with the gel medium. And I'm squeezing out 3 little donut holes here to show you how these things mix. This is just bird gravel, sand, and you can mix that in with the acrylic, or you can use sawdust, you could use vermiculite, you could use powdered carborundum, you can use almost anything. And plaster that on the painting surface. Gives you a nice textural surface. You can mix color in with that as well as you're going, or you can color it later on by painting over that surface. In fact, this is a surface here that is completely dry, and you can paint over that. That gives you an idea of how that material holds. At this point, you can begin to paint over it, glaze over it, and continue to build heavy textural areas that way. You can also add any pigment that you want to the acrylic. You can use a school grade powdered tempera color if you would like. And that makes an acrylic student grade color. Takes a little time for these fluffy powders to be mixed into the acrylic. And if you sneeze while you're mixing, the whole room becomes a color. You'll have a green room. And in a minute I'll mix some fluorescence for you because that's interesting. Some of the artists working today, such as Stella, use some unusual colors. And you've got an acrylic color, very inexpensive. These colors, however, will fade out. They are not permanent. This is a fluorescent pigment that you can use. And anything that can be mixed with water can be mixed with the acrylics. You can use watercolor, you can use tempera, you can use powdered color, but just remember that those colors have to be permanent that you're using. And there's a color for you. That will fade out eventually, but it'll still retain some of the intensity of that color. In fact, you may remember that cadmium red light is a very intense orange-red material. This is cadmium red light in comparison to the fluorescent. Now, on your TV set, you're probably getting a lot of vibration around here, and you can't see that too well. But this looks like a raw umber, or it looks like a red oxide in comparison now to the fluorescent color. You have two other mediums that you use besides the gel medium and the gloss medium, and these are materials that give a matte quality to a painting. Sometimes the acrylic paintings are much too glossy. If that's true, you mix your color with matte medium. That kills the color. It's dead. Matte medium in one coat, one thin coat, can be used as a final varnish, but too many coats of matte medium over top of a dark area will give you fog or a milky-looking substance. If you don't know how to make fog, this is instant fog in a bottle. Okay, so make sure you don't put too much of that stuff over your darker colors. If you have an area that's too glossy and that you want to calm down, matte varnish is used to calm that down. It gives you a non-reflective surface, but it also gives you some depth to that surface. It doesn't kill the color as matte medium would. In the Liquitex line, there is a big difference between the color that comes in the tube and the color that comes in the jar. You don't buy just because of container. You buy the paint because of the way it works. Now, the tube color is a very viscous paint. It's a heavy paint. When you squeeze it out, it stays there on the painting surface. It has the consistency, something like that, say, of oil paint. And you can move it around, and it produces knife marks and brush strokes. It doesn't fold over. It doesn't flow quite too well. It has that viscosity that you need for tactile painting. The same color in jar color, however, is quite fluid. It will flow down the surface, and when you mix water with it, it immediately goes into a very fluid paint. So it depends on how you work as to which one you buy. If you are impressionistic or expressionistic, you should be using the tube color. It has that tactile quality, the gutsy quality that you're after. Almost every other painting technique, you should be buying jar color. For a magic reel technique, very tiny brush strokes, detailed realism done with a triple-aught red sable brush, use the jar color. It flows easily down the page. If you're using tube color, you got to scumble about halfway down. Jar color flows all the way down. If you're using it in a super real image, and many artists use this with an airbrush, such as Audrey Flack, Paul Sarkisian, and so on, these people use the jar color, a very fluid material. The tube color will tend to clog the brush. The jar color flows through without any problem. If you use tube color, you'll spend half your life cleaning up your airbrush if you use the improper material. Also, if you're using it for a hard edge or an optical technique, flat areas of opaque, intense color, designer kind of color, then jar color. It takes 3 times as much water to add to the tube color as it does the jar color to make it flow. So the tube color is 3 times more transparent when it flows well. So 1 coat of the jar color will do the same thing as 3 coats of the tube color in flat, opaque, intense areas of color. So you can see the uses of the jar color. When it's fluid, you want jar color. Designer color, when you're using it on cloth, and it is a good textile paint among other things, you want to use the jar color. Let me show you a few examples of painting on cloth with the acrylic. This is one that is almost 20 years old. It's been washed, ironed, sent to the cleaners. Acrylics are quite permanent on cloth that way. Here's another in staining a cloth. This could easily be a painting as well as a tablecloth. And you can thin the acrylic jar color down 80% with water, if you would like, if it is absorbed by the surface on which you paint. If it stays on top of the surface, you need more medium. So if you're painting on a surface that is non-absorbent, such as canvas that has not been prepared correctly, then you should add medium as well as water to your colors to thin them. 50% medium, 50% water. That's a good rule to add to your colors so you don't get in trouble and reduce the binder down. However, on staining canvas, on staining cloth, using it as a textile paint, you can thin up to 80% if it permeates the cloth. The rule is wash out the cloth, wash out any sizing that might be in the cloth, thin your colors, and make sure that they permeate the cloth, that they come through on the opposite side, that you see that image, a ghost image on the opposite side. That way you can send them to the cleaners. If it sits on top of the cloth, it stands a very good chance of washing out. This is a napkin done the same way. You can also paint directly on cloth for T-shirts and for decorative designs on almost any cloth you can think of. Nylon is a little bit difficult. It might peel off. Test the cloth surface first. This is airbrushing onto a T-shirt, done in about 2 or 3 minutes at most, and I'll show you how this is done when we get to some airbrushing here. You can also use the acrylics as a stamp or as a printing material. This is a print on cloth here. And you can even block out the silk screen with the medium and water. This is a image that was painted onto the silk screen, with melted wax. So your original image is painting it on there with melted wax. Then the screen is given 3 coats of half water and half medium. That seals the surface. And then you put newspaper underneath this and on top of this and iron the wax out between the newspaper. That gives you a block out for the screen. And you can use the acrylic as a silk screen ink. This is a print from that particular screen on a high nap fabric. It's a very painterly type of design that is done that way. Many artists use this in the fine art field as well. Andy Warhol, for instance, uses acrylics because they are permanent and give you colors that he can't get with the traditional silk screen material. You can also marble on cloth or on paper with the acrylics. Marbling is floating the acrylic that has been thinned a little bit with water on a thick water. Now, thick water is a water that has been made to solidify a little bit by using carrageenan, which is called Irish moss. You can buy it in a health food store, or you can use just liquid starch. And the image here is on paper. For this image, the thinned acrylic was just dropped onto the thick water and combed very, very quickly to create that design. This is another design created that way, just by raking a piece of stick through there, or a pin through there, or a painting knife through there. Another design here, a little bit more loosely done. With the paper, you don't need to mortise. Now, mortise means make the material accept the acrylic a little bit more readily. On cloth, some cloth has to be mortised, meaning that you paint or wash the cloth in alum water. And alum is a pickling spice that you can buy quite readily. Here, this is marbling on acrylic that is made into a vest. It's all silk. Okay, now through the magic of time-lapse video, we're going to show you how to do marbling in just a couple of minutes. The first process is to just get yourself a nice tray, cheap one, one of the little aluminum trays they use for baking, and fill it full of liquid starch. Once the starch is in the pan, let it sit for a while to eliminate bubbles, and mix your colors. And you mix jar color or tube color, you can use for this, with water until you get to the consistency of about light cream, just so that it will drip easily from the painting knife or from a brush. And now that we have all the colors mixed to the consistency of light cream, you just start by dropping those colors onto the surface of the starch. Some will spread a little bit more than others. If that happens, if it spreads too much, add a little bit more color. If it doesn't spread enough, add a little bit more water. Now, while these colors are floating on the surface, you can also comb them into different shapes as well. But we're going to continue to drop color until we get a marbling type of design here. As you can see, some are a little bit more contained than others, some spread more than others. Don't worry about it, just let things happen that way. And if you want, again, you can pull out different designs if you would like. Now, the process of marbling consists of then drawing through the design, making a marble design. Another way to do that is to make yourself a comb. Now, this is just nails stuck into a piece of cardboard, and these are then set in place with some tape. And you just comb it across the surface to make a marble design. Very simple marble design that way. Now we can take a print from the surface. This is just construction paper. You can use any absorbent paper. You can use any cloth that absorbs well. Remember, you might have to wash the cloth in alum water. Put the cloth on or the paper on so there are no bubbles. Wait until the paper starts to curl at the end and pull up the paper. Now, it looks like at times your design would be ruined because it is running down the surface. But all you have to do is bring it to a surface here and take the excess design and the excess starch off by putting some Kleenex or some paper towel over it to remove that. That gives you your design. Now, to clean the surface for another print, all you do is cut some newspaper into strips and rake the surface of the design. That pushes the paint through the surface of the starch so it doesn't print on the next print. You could get a ghost print from the original, but for a good clean print you need to do another design. Acrylic jar color is also a good paint to use with the airbrush. The airbrush is quite easily done, and when you buy an airbrush, buy a mask as well, a particle mask, so you don't breathe in particles that you're spraying out. In fact, even if you're spraying just water, as I am right now, you should be wearing a mask. You don't want to breathe anything other than oxygen into your lungs. If you breathe in water for a long period of time, that's called drowning, right? So buy a mask when you buy an airbrush. This is a double-action airbrush. That means when you push down, you get air. When you pull back, you get a controlled amount of fluid, so you can control the line. This particular brush has a medium-sized needle in it, which gives it its flow, which means you can get a fair line, but not a very, very fine line. And when you pull back, you get fogs of color and so on. You can come in and get fairly decent line with this, but not every hair on your head that way. Most artists would tend to use a stencil or frisket paper or something like that to cut out shapes and areas. You can use anything that you would like as a stencil if you're spraying in broad areas of color. Just the top of the jar would do fine. And come back and give it a little bit of roundness. This is jar color, remember, not tube color. And you're mixing, and I've pre-mixed the color here, 50% with water. You can go up to about 70% with water without any problem. That's if you're spraying on an absorbent surface. If you're spraying on canvas, remember you need to add half water and half medium. These are clouds. It's just clouds that are torn from the type of paper I'm using, Strathmore drawing paper, and they're also mountains. Very, very quickly done. Remember the t-shirt that I showed you? That's how it was done, right there. Very quickly done. If you want bird in flight, and you can get lines of force as well. Changing color is quite easy. You don't really have to clean the brush in between each one. Just layer another color over. Let it mix in the brush at times. Airbrush is quite easy. It takes about a couple of hours to be able to control it that way. And you don't have to clean the brush out until the end of the day. At the end of the day, do clean the brush thoroughly. And during the day, I will keep the tip of the brush in water so it doesn't clog. Acrylics will not clog the brush. They will not stick to any hard, shiny surface. There are booklets on airbrushing techniques that you can buy, and books on it, such as Airbrush Action and so on. And in fact, this one includes the work of a friend of mine, Robert Anderson, who has also written a book with Robert Pascal on airbrush techniques. You can also use the acrylics in a spray for a fixative. What you need is to mix about half water and half medium, either gloss medium, matte medium, or matte varnish, in a container, in a spray container. Any household type spray container will work, one that you use to spray flowers with, and mix those up about half and half water, half medium. And this will then be used as a fixative for chalk, pastel, any graphic media that way. Just make sure you have a fairly fine mist spray. Now what I need to do, and again remember, if you're spraying for a long period of time, don't breathe that in. I just need to get enough chalk or pastel up here so you can see what happens when the acrylic medium is used as a fixative. If you use gloss medium as the fixative, it will act as an intensifier to the color. It will bring up the color. If you use matte medium, it will dull the color, and if you use matte varnish, the color stays approximately the same. You can maybe see when I spray this over top that the color comes up, becomes a little bit more intense. Now that's what you should do to fix a drawing, and if you do that, it's nice and fine mist spray. I'm going to over fix this. Do what you should not do, because medium plus pigment makes a paint. So you can take a drawing that is done in chalk or pastel and literally make it into a painting this way. And you can cut back in with more color. In fact, I've seen large murals done this way and covered with gloss medium, so they have that high gloss intensity, and they look exactly like an oil painting. You can't tell the difference between acrylic and oil at times. And you can even take the tubed color if you'd like and draw back into the painting with it. These little caps are what they use for cake decorators. The same people that make these tubes make that awful cake icing kind of stuff. And you can squeeze or screw those caps right on these squeeze tubes and put a three-dimensional line in there if you'd like. Anything goes with acrylics. You're not limited by the material. It doesn't present barriers between you and expression. You don't think watercolor or chalk or airbrush or whatever. Anything can be accomplished without having to go by category. Acrylics can also be used for watercolor techniques. Again, the jar color should be the color of choice. It flows a little bit better, thins a little bit better. For watercolor techniques, you just add a lot of water. That's all there is to it. Huge amount of water gives you watercolor. Use just a little bit of transparent color, a whole lot of water, and you can work wet and wet. And then wash techniques, dry brush techniques, all the same things that you do with watercolor can be done with acrylics. They blend about the same way, handle almost the same way, dry in the same amount of time. However, once the watercolor in acrylic is dry, it is waterproof. So when you paint over, you just get another wash over top of the watercolor, you don't get mud. So I can go over this now dry brush technique with another color without picking up anything at all. You can continue to throw wash over wash that way for some very unusual depth of color and intensity of color. Traditional gimmicks can also be accomplished. You can scrape through, and that's what the bevel on this brush is for scraping out areas of color if you don't like it. For adding emphasis, you can draw into it, and that collects line. All these gimmicks that are traditionally done can be continued. You can pick out highlights with razor blades when you're through. The watercolor, when it dries, is waterproof. You don't even have to put a glass over it to preserve it that way. You can also use a watercolor technique on canvas, such as color field painting, such as the work of Helen Frankenthal and Maurice Lewis. But you have to do something to the surface of the canvas to make it accept a watercolor technique. As you can see here, this does not accept the stain very well. You have to break down the surface tension of the canvas, and in order to do that, warm water and just a scrub brush will work. Scrub that surface, and you can let that dry at that point. That breaks the surface tension. It will accept the color. Or you can go right back into it and use it as a watercolor, as you would on a watercolor paper. The acrylics are especially suitable for color field painting, for stain painting, because if you used oil, you would wash out the binder. The acrylic is quite permanent. The oil would not be permanent at all. Directly from the jar, Liquitex acrylics work like a tempera or a casein paint. You can dip directly in that jar and work immediately on the surface. This is a transparent color, but you can opaque that color by adding white or another opaque color. The colors dry relatively matte and have the surface appearance of a gouache, tempera, designer color, so on. Dry quite quickly, which is the way I used to teach. If you make a mistake every 15 minutes, you've got a chance to correct that mistake. This is almost dry up in this area and over in here, so at that point I can immediately paint out if I don't like it. So every 15 minutes you get a chance to make it right. You learn good technique that way. While it's wet, you can scrape through there, use the painting knife, and you can even make a egg tempera that is relatively more permanent by adding the yolk of an egg to the jar color, and that does away with the problems of egg tempera being a very brittle material that you can't paint on a flexible support. It's all up to taste. You just add yolk until it has the proper feel. You have to have the proper binder in there, so don't add too much of the egg yolk. The tube color, as we mentioned before, has to be used when you want heavy, tactile, or oil-like painting. So tube color, used directly, gives you that feel. And as I've said before in videos, it's nice to get free paint when you're doing these. And I just need enough on here to show you the manipulations of tube color a little bit more than we started with in this video. It holds a knife mark and a brush stroke quite easily. And it shouldn't roll over and play dead. It should give you nice gutsy manipulations that way. And you can use the brush as well. For heavy tactile painting. It's almost sort of a landscape, seascape kind of thing. You could begin to throw in trees or boats or whatever you want that way. But what I want to show you here is the very, very heavy tactile quality. You can't tell the difference between this and an oil painting. In fact, many oil paintings have been called acrylic, and many acrylic paintings have been exhibited as oil. Even curators find it very difficult at times on first glance to tell the difference between oil and acrylic. Since acrylics do dry quite quickly, there's also a retarding medium that you can use with them to slow the drying time. But before you do that, you should seal the surface that you're painting on. If you seal the surface, it absorbs a lot of the water. Since this dries by water evaporation, then you will double your working time right there. So seal the surface with matte medium. That'll give you a little bit extended time, and then you can use some retarding medium with your color. This is retarding medium. It's a honey-like substance that way. And you can add color to the retarding medium directly. But this is too much retarding medium. Put in less retarding medium, because if you put in that much, you will reduce the binder down so it does not form a film correctly. There's another thing you can do with the retarding medium. Once you have sealed the surface with the matte medium, is to lay on a thin layer of retarding medium, trowel it around like that, and then work back into the area with color. That will give you at least double the working time to 3 times the working time that you normally expect. You can get an hour or so working time from a surface like that. And if you really want to blend quickly, use a fan blender. That gives you very quick blendings of color in acrylic that are sometimes very necessary to achieve. So remember that you're using mediums with the acrylics, just as you use mediums with oil. You don't just add turpentine to oil. You don't just add water to acrylics. The gel medium and the gloss medium give you the feel and the look and the depth of color that oil has. If you don't use those mediums, it goes dead, and you have to put it on afterward. It's like using a retouch varnish over oil painting when the oil color sinks in. There's also a material that is not really a medium. It is a sculptural material called modeling paste. Modeling paste is a material that is used for sculptural form. As it comes, it is a little bit sticky material, and it's kind of hard to work with. It's kind of hard to model with. So what you do is allow the modeling paste to dry out a little bit if you want to use it directly. From this original container, you could put that in a cake decorator and squeeze out very Baroque and Rococo patterns, say on raw wood frames, and decorate a frame quite quickly and quite readily. But once you have allowed the modeling paste to dry a little bit, you can pick it out of the jar like this, and it works like clay. You can roll it around as you would roll clay. It has the same disadvantages of clay while you're working with it. If you let it dry too quickly, it will develop shrinkage cracks. So drape it with a plastic bag and allow the drying to be somewhat slow. Now, modeling paste is basically marble dust and polymer medium. There's some other things in there, of course, but that's the 2 basic ingredients. And it air dries to stone. Once it's modeled, it dries to stone. Now, this is the wet material here, but I have a piece that's dry right here. And that is rock at that point. And you have to use a mallet and a chisel and a rasp to work with it. You work with it as you would work with stone. You can polish it down to look like stone if you would like. Now, because this is an inflexible modeling paste, you can't use it on a flexible support, as many other brands. So if you want to use modeling paste as a flexible modeling paste, you would then add gel medium to the paste. About 50% gel medium and 50% modeling paste gives you a flexible material that you can then at that point use on a support that is flexible. And you can use it also as an extender, but it does act as a weak tinting white. So now you have a material that is quite flexible on the surface of the painting. This is a piece that was done with modeling paste to the replica of the Venus of Willendorf, a 15,000 BC piece. And this is dried to stone. At that point, it is rock. You can bounce it up and down off the floor almost if you'd like to. And these materials are very permanent outside. The modeling paste will dry to a solid sculptural mass. You can use a core inside of it if you would like to save money. But it is stronger than concrete. It'll go through freeze-thaw cycles outside. A very, very permanent sculptural material. I know this has been a very fast survey of acrylic techniques, and we hope to expand on those in future videos. In the meantime, there are technical brochures that will give you a little bit more information on the material, including the use of acrylics as one of the best outside mural painting materials in existence today. There's a shorter version of that folder that comes in sets. There is a marbling with acrylic technique folder. There's a Liquitex acrylic on cloth folder, and there's even a brochure on how to choose a brush. There is a how to mix and use color booklet, which goes into structuring palettes, how to mix any color that you want immediately, how to save money in mixing color. That is coupled with the acrylic color map and mixing guide. The first in the art video series is a video on mixing color. My name is Russell Woody. I hope to see you in future tapes on materials and techniques.